This is the United States Air Force Convair B-36 bomber, mainstay of the Strategic Air Command in the early 1950s. Sometimes referred to as the Peacemaker, it was the largest bomber ever built. The 36 also had another name, the Big Stick. With its unusual, almost hushed sound of 6 huge pusher propellers, this Cold War giant best reflected Teddy Roosevelt's advice on foreign policy: speak softly and carry a big stick. However, this giant's tremendous size proved to be its downfall.
It's good that they never had to fly military missions because they'd have been sitting ducks. The B-36 reflected a radar cross-section pattern of 44 square meters, which is tremendous. The crews always knew they were going to be in trouble when they tried to invade any Russian target.
In an attempt to shore up its defenses, the B-36 also carried the greatest turret defense system ever devised. Although it never appeared obvious from the outside, the B-36 was festooned with a host of retractable gun turrets. Each turret was equipped with 2 20mm cannons capable of firing in almost every possible direction. However, with the exception of tail defense, the Big Stick was the last chapter in the saga of the turret-equipped self-defending bomber. It's a story almost as old as the airplane itself. It was a run-and-gun battle 1,200 miles long. High above Germany, they fought against the Luftwaffe's deadliest fighters. Armed with the most sophisticated turrets ever devised, the air gunners from the United States Army Air Force and the Royal Air Force not only battled for their lives, but for the success and key to Allied victory, strategic bombing. Born above the trenches of World War I, the air gunner was a new type of warrior. Armed with 1 or 2 machine guns, it was his job to battle all incoming enemy fighters. It was a daunting task. Sub-zero temperatures, turbulence, and icy slipstream winds made aiming very difficult. The results were often discouraging, but the belief in the self-defending bomber was firmly entrenched. By the 1930s, the first turret-armed bombers began to appear. World War II. The RAF has the world's only bomber force armed with the latest gun turrets. Early bomber losses were horrendous, but faith in the turret-equipped bomber remained. For the Americans, belief in the turret-armed B-17 and B-24 was unshakable. By 1943, however, that faith had been torn to shreds. In the Pacific, the B-29 represented the last best hope for the self-defending bomber. Armed with the world's most advanced remote-controlled turret system, determined Japanese fighter attacks soon found their mark. After World War II, the air gunner and the powered turret all but disappeared. New jet bombers relied on height and speed for protection, but they did retain one defensive turret, the Stinger's tail. Just 8 years after the Wright brothers first took flight, the air gunner was born. June 7, 1910. 2 men flying a Model B Wright Flyer fire a Lewis machine gun while airborne. For Lieutenant Thomas DeWitt Milling and Charles de F. Chandler, it was a straightforward experiment. Sitting side by side, DeWitt flew the Model B while Chandler fired a full drum of 47 bullets from his machine gun. It was a remarkable feat. Roughly 12% of the bullets found their mark. European tests soon followed. November 27, 1910. Pilot Marcus D. Manton and gunner Lieutenant Stillingworth fire a Lewis gun from their Graham-Witt biplane. 25 rounds result in 11 hits. A second longer burst of 47 rounds was less successful, with just 15 hits. These 2 experiments represented a radical shift in military capability. For the first time, armed aircraft were capable of killing from the air. Soon, they would be one of the most destructive weapons ever devised. World War I. At the outbreak of hostilities, all the warring nations were equipped with aircraft, but very few were designed to carry a machine gun. One exception was the Vickers FB-5 gun bus. As the world's first operational fighter, it required an observer gunner to make a kill. The most effective way to mount a machine gun was to put the engine in the rear, with the observer gunner up front and the pilot directly behind. Moderately successful, the FB-5 and other pusher types would be rendered obsolete with the introduction of the Fokker-Eindecker in July 1915. The Fokker-Eindecker, the world's first true fighter. Using synchronized gun gear, it was capable of shooting between its propeller blades. The advantages were enormous. Guns mounted in front of the cockpit were well placed. Straight-line aiming was now possible. Success was immediate, and so was the response. British and French reconnaissance aircraft added more free-mounted machine guns for self-defense. Flying solo often meant certain death. Staggered formations were devised to give small formations of aircraft covering fields of fire. But it wasn't enough. Fighter pilots, on both sides, learned to avoid the rear gunner's field of fire. For the observer gunner, it was an extremely difficult task. Battling icy slipstream winds and paralyzing cold, rear gunners often fought a losing battle. Many observer gunners learned their craft on the job. Hitting a fast-moving aircraft from another moving machine proved extremely difficult and would remain so well into the Second World War and beyond. By 1915, the Royal Flying Corps realized a new training program was needed. New qualifications were laid down. New observer gunners were now capable of not only defending their aircraft, but were trained to use cameras, send wireless messages, and direct accurate artillery barrages. By 1917, the pusher had all but disappeared, replaced by the more efficient tractor type. One of the best two-seaters was the Bristol F-2B fighter. Nicknamed the King of the Two-Seaters, it quickly became one of the most successful fighters of the war. With a forward-firing machine gun and two in the rear, the F-2B had an extremely effective 1-2 punch. 126 observer gunners alone claimed ace status while flying in the F-2B. As the war progressed, new and larger bombers entered service. The de Havilland DH-4 day bomber, the Handley Page O-100 heavy bomber, and the giant Zeppelin Staaken 4-engine heavy. All had multiple gunners, but it was never enough when faced with a determined fighter opposition. By war's end, the observer air gunner's role and equipment remained relatively unchanged. The gunner's cockpit was still open to the elements. Oxygen was still experimental. The rifle-caliber machine gun was still in use, and protective clothing consisted of layers of leather, fur, and canvas. 20 years later, early Second World War air gunners faced some of the same problems, but help was on the way. The impact of the airplane on the World War I battlefield was minimal. What did emerge was the vital role of the air gunner and the influence it would have on any future bomber design. The German bombing of London during the First World War introduced a new kind of warfare: strategic bombing. Men like U.S. Brigadier General Mitchell and Britain's Chief of Air Staff, Major General Sir Hugh Trenchard, firmly believed the best defense against any attack was to bomb the aggressor's capacity to wage war, destroy his factories and cities, and peace would soon follow. Theory, however, was far from reality. In June 1930, the Handley Page Hayford was the RAF's most advanced bomber. A fabric-covered biplane, the Hayford's performance and bomb load was pitiful. A new type of bomber was needed. In 1932, the Glenn L. Martin Aircraft Company introduced the revolutionary Martin B-10 monoplane bomber.
When the Martin B-10 bomber was introduced in 1932, it revolutionized bomber design. It was an all-metal monoplane bomber, tractable landing gear, variable pitch propellers. It had enclosed cockpit for the pilot and the first turret mounted on the nose. Now, it wasn't powered, but it was manually operated and gave the gunner full enclosure from which to operate. It had a high speed, about 215 miles an hour. So at the time, it was faster than the leading fighters in the world. And that just reinforced the proponents of the bomber that the bomber would always get through. With its speed, the fighters couldn't catch it. With its armament, even those fighters that did get close to it would be shot down, and the bomber would get to its target.
Across the Atlantic, the RAF introduced the Boulton-Paul Overstrand bomber, equipped with the world's first powered turret. Mounted on the nose, it was a major step forward and received worldwide attention. For gunners, it was a marvel. Seated in a draft-free, heated enclosure, gunners achieved a hit rate of 55% against towed targets, compared to just 15% using Scarff rings in open cockpits. But it was far from perfect. Powered by compressed air, it had a slow rate of rotation and could only defend the bomber from head-on attacks. To solve the problem of turret propulsion, the British turned to a French design that combined electrics and hydraulics. The self-contained hydraulic generator, powered by an electric motor, was confined to the rotating portion of the turret. As a self-contained unit, it provided the gunner with a comfortable seat and sealed gun apertures. Remarkably, the French aircraft industry and government were not interested in the design. Britain was more than happy to acquire the license for the turret and quickly instructed their firms to produce competing designs. Bristol, Fraser-Nash, and Boulton-Paul all responded with new powered turrets. Surprisingly, Germany's aircraft rearmament program in the 1930s did not include powered turrets. Major advances in airframe and power plant development produced bombers like the Heinkel HE-111, Junkers Ju-87, and the multi-role Junkers Ju-88. The Germans believed that speed, altitude, and handheld rifle caliber machine guns would defeat any fighter attack. The Junkers Ju-86, the Luftwaffe's first monoplane bomber. Introduced in 1934, the Ju-86 incorporated a number of new self-defense innovations. The nose was fully enclosed with a manually manipulated front turret. A retractable dustbin turret provided lower defense, and the dorsal position was partially enclosed. Just as the new monoplane bombers began to enter service, a new and bold aerial experiment began to unfold over the skies of Spain. In 1936, Spain erupts into a savage civil war. Both sides received the latest fighters and bombers from major powers, eager to test their aircraft and tactics.
During the Spanish Civil War, the Germans and the Italians and the Soviets had a great testbed for their latest designs. The Germans introduced the Heinkel HE-111 and the Dornier Do-17 bomber, while the Italians introduced the SM-79 3-engine bomber. Now, all these bombers were monoplane. The German bombers were all metal, quite fast, and armed with handheld machine guns and no turrets.
Early versions of the German Heinkel HE-111 proved extremely effective. Sleek and fast, the all-metal HE-111 only reinforced what many already believed. A fast, well-defended bomber would be immune from fighter interception. Bombers like the HE-111, the Dornier Do-17, and the Italian Savio Marchetti SM-79 were difficult to intercept and shoot down. The results didn't go unnoticed. Bomber advocates in Britain and the US saw the Spanish experience as proof well-defended bombers could attack their targets with near impunity. But there was a major flaw. Fighter interception during the Spanish Civil War was rudimentary. There was no radar, with both sides relying on ground observers to spot incoming raids. Fabric-covered biplane fighters like the Fiat CR-32 and Polikarpov I-15 found it difficult to reach the high-flying monoplane bombers.
Now, one of the key things you have to remember about bombers and fighters is interception. For a fighter to intercept a bomber, it had to have a lot of lead time. You had to know the bomber force was coming. The fighter had to climb to altitude and get into position to shoot the bomber down. Now, in order to do that, the folks on the ground had to know the speed of the bombers, the height of the bombers. So for a fighter to get off the ground, climb to altitude, and reach a bomber formation was extremely difficult, especially in the Spanish Civil War. There was no radar, and the warning for bomber raids were visual. So by the time a visual sighting was made and interceptors took off, the bombers were well on their way home. The other problem was the fighters, their speed, in comparison to the bombers, was sometimes slower. So in order for them to intercept, they had to get up to height and be above the bombers and dive on the bombers in order to intercept. So for the Germans and the Italians, the lessons they learned from the Spanish Civil War was that their fast bombers armed with handheld machine guns were enough to get to the target and bomb the target.
The lessons learned in Spain would have a direct effect on the use of air power at the outbreak of World War II and beyond. In the United States, turret development before 1939 was slow to non-existent. Even the famous B-17, when it first appeared, did not have powered turrets. American attitudes at the time considered turrets to be too heavy and too complicated. September 1939, the German Blitzkrieg begins. The Royal Air Force has the only strategic bomber force equipped with the most advanced turrets in the world. Bombers like the Vickers Wellington and Armstrong Whitworth Whiteley are equipped with nose and tail Fraser-Nash powered turrets. The Bristol Blenheim had the Bristol Mark V center turret. With just 5 squadrons of Wellingtons and 9 with the Whitley, it's hardly a strategic force. Many believed, however, that the bomber, armed with powered turrets, would always get through. A belief that was based on nothing but faith, political expediency, and fear. The British also developed the world's first powered turret fighters, the Boulton-Paul Defiant and Blackburn Rock. Both were 2-seat single-engine fighters with no guns in the wings. The Defiant and Rock were never designed to engage other enemy fighters. Their sole purpose was to shoot down unescorted enemy bombers using their powered turrets. Both aircraft never got the chance. Against enemy fighters, both the Rock and Defiant suffered heavy losses.
It rather looked like a Hurricane, and they were going to fit a turret on this fighter and mix it with gaggles of Hurricanes, hoping that it would surprise their enemy fighters. Indeed, initially that was true, but it didn't take them long to twig this, and they also twigged that it had no forward-firing armament. So it was a very short period of, if you like, success.
Air gunner training at the beginning of the war was in many ways a rudimentary affair. Armed with a 12-gauge shotgun, a gunner manipulates his Fraser-Nash FN-5 turret. Clay pigeons are used to sharpen the gunner's aim and fine-tune his turret manipulation skills. But just how effective were these early turrets?
In terms of the efficiency or the effectiveness of the turrets, the early turrets especially, they were really calibrated for aircraft that were possibly slower than the ones that they were actually intercepting. It was new to them as well. It's really new technology. You've got rifle caliber machine guns that are supposed to give an effective spray to hit an aircraft that is now approaching at probably over 270, 300 knots, especially in a head-on, which is going to be much more than that. They were also moving towards more of an optical arrangement for targeting, so their aiming was different as well. And they're moving from training gunners in Virginias and Hawker Harts and Hawker Demons to all of a sudden be in closed turrets. That in itself, with the fogging and all the other things. The efficiency of the early turrets, it's difficult to assess.
The RAF and United States Army Air Force both believed in the dominance of the bomber. They also believed that with enough defensive armament, bombers in tight formation could fight off any fighter attack, strike a target, and return to base. early results were not promising. Raids on German naval targets by Blenheims and Hamptons suffered heavy losses. Poor formation keeping and inadequate defensive firepower were to blame. December 18, 1939. 24 RAF Wellingtons target German warships off Wilhelmshaven. The weather is perfect. From 70 miles away, an experimental German Freya radar station detects the inbound formation. Fighters are scrambling. The Fraser-Nash turrets, armed with just two 303-inch caliber machine guns, are not enough. Cannon-armed BF-109s and ME-110s rip the Wellington formation apart, shooting down 12 over the target. 6 more crash land after reaching the English coast. It's a devastating blow. Further losses during the battles for Norway and Denmark in April of 1940 forced Bomber Command's hand. With few options and no long-range escort fighters, RAF Bomber Command changes tactics and turns to night bombing.
Well, the decision by the RAF to turn to night bombing was obviously in response to being heavily mauled, especially during the Battle of France. Some of their light bombers were really decimated. So they knew that they could not defend themselves against any fighter force or even anti-aircraft. There was no fighter at that point that could defend the bombers. But it was an interesting decision because with the accuracy of bombing at that time, night bombing increased the level of inaccuracies, if you will. Getting close to the target at that point was probably 30 miles from the target. Whereas when we go later into the war with radar, they're bombing within feet with their precision bombing. But it was an interesting decision, but I think it was really precipitated upon the fact that they had developed fighters that weren't escort fighters, they were interceptors, and they were turning to strategic bombing, which was not the same way that it was in 1918 when they had first started it.
The Boeing B-17. No other aircraft represented the idea of the self-defending bomber better than the mighty B-17. July 28, 1935, Seattle, Washington. The Boeing Model 299 takes flight. Bristling with multiple machine guns, the Seattle Times dubs the new bomber the Flying Fortress. The YB-17 would follow with the B-17B and C model entering service in 1937. From this point forward, the B-17, along with the consolidated B-24, were central to the development of both strategic bombing and the powered turret. The first B-17 to see combat belonged to the RAF's No. 90 Squadron. Equipped with the B-17C, operations began in July of 1941. The British were eager to test the B-17's high-altitude performance and defensive armament. Hardly a fortress, the B-17C was far from combat ready. Armed with handheld 50 caliber machine guns in the dorsal, ventral, and waist positions, with one 303-inch caliber gun in the nose, it had no powered turrets. Equipped with turbo-supercharged engines, the B-17 was capable of flying higher than any other British bomber. Missions at 30,000 feet were common, but the results were disappointing. Bombing was inaccurate, guns froze at altitude. Luftwaffe fighters, undeterred by the B-17's defensive armament, pressed home their attacks with increasing accuracy. By the end of 1941, only 4 of the original 20 B-17Cs remained. In response, a massive redesign was ordered. The result was the B-17E, the first American bomber to see action with powered turrets. Equipped with both a Sperry top and ball turret, the B-17E carried 8 50 caliber machine guns, including 2 in the Stinker's tail. Hydraulically powered by a self-contained electro-hydraulic unit, the Sperry A1 top turret had a traverse speed of 40 degrees per second and 360-degree rotation. Armed with 2 M2 50 caliber machine guns and a K3 computer gun sight, the Sperry turret posed a real threat to any attacking fighter. The Briggs Sperry ball turret was an ingenious design. As the most compact turret in service, it was capable of holding a gunner, 2 M2 50 caliber machine guns, and a gun sight. Turret speed was 30 degrees per second, with a full 360-degree rotation. The Sperry ball turret was the only really effective belly turret of the war. August 12, 1942. 12 B-17Es of the 97th Bomb Group set off on the 8th Air Force's first bombing mission of the war. Escorted by 9 squadrons of RAF Spitfires, they successfully bombed the railroad marshalling yards at Rouen-Sotteville, France.
So in 1942, the U.S. has entered the war, and they begin sending bombers over to England to begin the buildup of the U.S. 8th Air Force. Early bombing operations with the B-17E and the B-17F proved successful, but they're bombing targets in France and Belgium, and the penetration isn't that deep. Plus, they have an escort of P-47s and RAF Spitfires. When they try to go deeper into the occupied countries in Germany, that's when they meet more resistance from the Luftwaffe, and that's where the fighter escort drops off. Even though they're flying in tight combat box formations with overlapping fields of fire, the losses begin to mount. Now, the B-17F was armed with, 11 50 caliber machine guns. It had 2 powered turrets, a Sperry on the top and a ball turret on the bottom. It also had a tail mount with twin 50 calibers, waist gunners, and 2 cheek mounted 50 calibers. So it was quite heavily armed. Later, as they began to make deeper penetrations into Germany, they found that even with these tight combat boxes, the Luftwaffe was finding a way to get into the bomber stream and shoot the bombers down. One of the things the Luftwaffe learned to do was attack head-on to the B-17, because that's where the B-17 was weakest in its defensive armament. So what happened was you had a fighter and a bomber closing in at 600 miles per hour, and the German pilot, his job was to get as many 20 millimeter or 30 millimeter cannon shells into the cockpit area or an engine on the B-17. And once he did this, the chances of the B-17 surviving were quite slim.
June 13, 1943. 227 B-17s bombed the U-boat yards at Bremen and Kiel. Losses are heavy, with 26 B-17s shot down. Air gunners claim 41 enemy fighters, but the Luftwaffe records show only 7 as shot down. The results were sobering. Even with the most advanced powered turrets of the time, B-17s flying in tight defensive formations were still vulnerable to determined fighter attacks. As losses mounted, USAAF commanders searched for an answer. The RAF and USAAF went into World War II with the fervent belief that the bomber would always get through. No matter how dense their opponent's air defenses, bombers would still be able to slip through and wipe out their intended targets. However, against the determined opposition of the Luftwaffe, it wasn't long before they were questioning their faith in this military doctrine. Even with the most sophisticated turret defenses of the time, bomber losses were heavy. As the Allies clawed their way deeper into Europe and looked to make a decisive blow against Japan, they could not be complacent. New strategies and technology were needed to ensure victory against 2 ever more desperate and deadly enemies. The RAF and USAAF went into World War II with the fervent belief that the bomber would always get through. No matter how dense their opponent's air defenses, bombers would still be able to slip through and wipe out their intended targets. However, against the determined opposition of the Luftwaffe, it wasn't long before they were questioning their faith in this military doctrine. Even with the most sophisticated turret defenses of the time, bomber losses were heavy. As the Allies clawed their way deeper into Europe and looked to make a decisive blow against Japan, they could not be complacent. New strategies and technology were needed to ensure victory against 2 ever more desperate and deadly enemies. When the USAAF began their bombing campaign in Europe, the hope was that tightly boxed formations of heavily armed B-17s would be almost impenetrable to German interceptor attacks. However, the Luftwaffe's fighters always seemed to find a way to crack the defenses of the flying fortresses. As losses mounted, USAAF commanders searched for an answer.
One idea they come up with is to create a B-17 gunship, the YB-40. So what they do is they add another top turret to the B-17. The waist gun position is increased to two 50 caliber machine guns. They're power assisted. They also mount a chin turret on the front of the B-17, throw a whole bunch of ammunition into it, and what they do is they were inserting these YB-40s gunships into the formations of B-17s as they went to Germany, and their job was to add extra firepower into the formation. Unfortunately for the YB-40, once the bomber formations had released their bomb loads, their speed increased. But the YB-40s didn't, so they tended to get left behind and were extremely ineffective. At the end of the day, I think they managed to shoot down two Luftwaffe fighters in their appearance in the European theater. So their appearance is short and they make a quick exit.
As an escort gunship, the YB-40 was a complete failure. 48 sorties were recorded. Just 5 German fighters were claimed shot down for the loss of 1 gunship. The extra weight of guns and additional turrets slowed the YB-40. After bomb drop, it could not keep pace with the rest of the formation. Despite the failure, the Bendix chin turret was incorporated into the new B-17G, giving it a total of 12 50 caliber machine guns. In Germany, turret development soon caught up with the Allies. The Focke-Wulf FW-200 was one of the most heavily armed 4-engine bombers.
Some weak point in the fuselage, because there are quite a number of cases of this aircraft landing quite heavily laden at times and breaking midway down the fuselage. I've seen at least 3 photos of this happening at Bordeaux-Merignac, where the Focke-Wulf 200C, the Courier, was based for anti-Atlantic work.
The Heinkel HE-177. Reaching service in October 1942, the HE-177 was heavily armed. It was the first and only heavy German bomber to mount a remote-controlled dorsal turret long before the B-29 appeared. Even with 720mm, 13mm, and 7.92mm cannons and machine guns, the HE-177 was restricted to strictly maritime and nighttime bombing operations. The Messerschmitt Me-410. Designed to replace the Me-110, the Me-410 was the first twin-engine fighter to be equipped with an advanced rear defense system. Operated by the rear observer, this remote gun system provided good protection over the entire rear hemisphere with very little drag. During 1943, the B-17F bore the brunt of early deep penetration raids into Germany. Losses were horrendous. American commanders clung to the idea of the self-defending bomber, despite the staggering losses. Even with the introduction of the B-17G, with the chin-mounted Bendix turret and improved tail turret, it was still vulnerable to fighter attack. Like the B-17, the consolidated B-24 Liberator entered service with more handheld guns than turrets. Entering RAF service first, British B-24s were equipped with 2 Bolt-and-Paul top and tail turrets. Each was armed with 4 303 caliber machine guns. In early combat, the B-24, like the B-17, was vulnerable to head-on attacks. The B-24J model addressed the problem with a nose-mounted Emerson or consolidated turret, armed with 2 50 caliber machine guns. It also carried a Martin top turret, Sperry ball, and a consolidated tail turret. Even with 4 powered turrets, the B-24 was still vulnerable against determined Luftwaffe fighter attacks. In the end, the massed formations of B-17s and B-24s could not defend themselves.
Interestingly enough, during the Battle of Britain, the Luftwaffe fights their battles and sends their bomber fleets over to England using fighter escort. During the Battle of France, the Luftwaffe learns that their bombers are not invulnerable to fighter attack. They faced for the first time monoplane fighters like the Spitfire, Hurricane, the Curtiss P-36 from the French Air Force. And even though they're victorious in France and Belgium and the Netherlands, the losses they suffered during that battle are quite high. And they begin to realize that their bombers, their Heinkels, their Ju-88s, their Dorniers, and even the Ju-87, without fighter escort, are vulnerable to fighter attack. So during the entire Battle of Britain, the Germans used fighter escort to escort their bombers into England. Of course, this lesson is not learned on the Americans, and they continue with the idea that their bombers in the future would be invulnerable to fighter attack.
By late 1943, the solution was clear. Only long-range escort fighters equipped with drop tanks could provide the heavy bombers with the protection they needed. In over 3.5 years of war, the USAAF lost 6,866 bombers to fighters, flak, and accidents. As the Americans pounded German targets by day and the RAF used the cover of darkness to attack Germany at night, losses to the Luftwaffe night fighters began to rise. New four-engine bombers like the Short Stirling, Avro Lancaster, and Handley Page Halifax were introduced starting in 1941. Each was equipped with 3 powered turrets, but it wasn't enough. The Short Stirling was the first RAF heavy bomber to enter service. Equipped with Fraser-Nash nose, dorsal, and tail turrets, it was armed with just 6 303-inch caliber machine guns. The Handley Page Halifax. Introduced in 1942, the Mark I was equipped with the Boulton-Paul nose, mid-upper, and tail turrets. The Boulton-Paul Type E rear turret was the most heavily armed with 4 303-inch machine guns, and one of the most successful turrets ever produced.
It also has to be remembered that the British bombers, like the Short Stirling, Handley Page Halifax, and Avro Lancaster, were all designed to be day bombers. So when the British adopted their night bombing techniques, they were using a bomber force that was largely equipped for daylight operations. Now, all the new heavy bombers that the British introduced in 42, they were all equipped with powered turrets, but they were armed only with Browning 303-inch machine guns, which were basically rifle caliber guns. It was a weak armament, and they hadn't really studied how the turret defenses would work at night, because now at night the bombers would be flying as individual aircraft. They would not be flying in formation and have the mutual protection of a large number of guns and overlapping fire. So they had to figure out how to use their trained gunners and turrets at night, and that was a very difficult process.
Developed from the failure of the Avro Manchester, the Avro Lancaster was the supreme bomb carrier. Powered by 4 Rolls-Royce Merlins, it was equipped with Fraser-Nash turrets in the nose, mid-upper, and tail positions. Like the Stirling and Halifax, it was one of the most lightly armed heavy bombers of the war, just 8 rifle caliber 303-inch machine guns. Designed as a day bomber, the Lancaster's turrets were even less effective at night. German night fighters, armed with 20mm and 30mm cannons, simply outgunned and outranged it. The nose turret was all but useless. German night fighters never attacked head-on. The top turrets saw little action. Tail gunners were the most active, but their contribution was minor. Spotting an approaching night fighter was difficult, let alone shooting it down. It's not so surprising RAF Bomber Command was slow to acknowledge a Lancaster had shot down a speedy Me-262. Eric Wells, in charge of electronic countermeasures, recalls his experience.
And in fact, our aircraft shot down an Me-262. The authorities would never allow us to confirm it, but I saw it with my own eyes. My 3 block plotting transmitters were working, so I took a moment to go up to the front, sit by the bomb aimer, who's also the front gunner. And as I got there, this aircraft was definitely the M92, and he opened a short burst and the thing just flew up. But the authorities wouldn't accept it. There is a note in my thing, enemy aircraft shot down, but they would not have it as a 262, but it was a 262.
The role of RAF gunners at night was far different from their American counterparts. Many RAF pilots did not want their gunners to open fire. Gunners were strictly used as lookouts, warning pilots of approaching fighters. Many pilots used evasive maneuvers like the corkscrew in order to survive.
It was either corkscrew left or corkscrew right. When the maneuver was called, it would basically turn hard left or hard right, and then would go down into a maneuver where it would basically do a corkscrew, where it would throw off the enemy fighter's aim and the contact. I mean, at night, it's really essential. The radar will give you an early contact. It'll give you a zone of sky to look for. But until you get a visual and can lock in on that visual, then you're not going to get a really essential aiming point, which is what they were looking for.
German night fighter tactics were simple. After locking onto a bomber with their radar, they would approach from below and the rear. They also had a secret weapon.
The Heinkel 219, one of the very innovative and successful features it had was Schräge. This was a system whereby on top of the cockpit, just between the two crew, were two 30mm cannon inclined forward at an angle of 60 degrees. With Schräge, you just flew under the aircraft, identified it. If it was the enemy, you then just blasted off with your cannon and you got him under the belly. And the interesting thing is, on the first ever sortie, operational sortie made by the Heinkel 219, it killed 6 Lancasters in one sortie.
The British heavies had no defense against attacks from below. A small number of Lancasters and Halifaxes were fitted with the Fraser-Nash FN-64 undergun turret. Aiming through the periscope sight proved difficult to overcome, and it was soon deleted. Just like their American counterparts, British heavy bomber losses began to mount. March 30th, 1944. The RAF sends 795 bombers to Nuremberg. On that clear moonlit night, 95 heavy bombers were shot down. For RAF Bomber Command, it's a complete disaster. Unable to defend themselves, the RAF's heavy bombers were at a clear disadvantage. Even before the Nuremberg raid, RAF loss rates were climbing steadily. To help defend the bombers, the RAF formed a top-secret electronics countermeasure unit. Known as No. 100 Group, its job was to disrupt and jam German radar and night fighter communications. What the turrets couldn't do, they would, with powerful airborne jammers. Flying high above the main bomber stream, specially modified Lancasters pumped out a constant stream of electronic noise. Some of the Lancasters also carried German-speaking personnel. Their job was to tune into Luftwaffe night fighter radio frequencies and give false and misleading instructions.
The RAF Lancaster had a normal crew of 7, but the special operator, as we were known as the ABC operator, we were number 8. Our position was a curtain placed right at the bottom steps beneath the mid-upper gunner at the center of the aircraft. Our job was to monitor German frequency. Very top secret in those days. You go on top of the blip flicker switch, that would eliminate that. I had 3 transmitters, so I could disturb 3 transmissions at the same time. And we were, of course, very vulnerable. First of all, because of the visual antennas, and secondly, because of the fact that we were broadcasting, so they could home on us. But we had a device called, they had a device called the Benito beacon, which would vector them onto us. And we had a device where we could bend that beacon. So instead of it pointing towards us, it bent it, and they were flying alongside us, beneath us, thinking they were on the right beacon. It's a very clever thing that at the time is brilliant.
So secret was their job that not even the crew they flew with knew what they were doing.
They kept us well apart from the others. And as I say, we were sworn to secrecy. We couldn't talk. We had not even the captain, our skipper, knew what we were doing. No one knew. It's completely and utterly secret. And we were the most unpopular guys on the bloody squadron, I can tell you.
By war's end, some Lancasters were equipped with the automatic gun-laying radar and two .50 caliber machine guns in the tail. The radar had its limitations. The IFF, Identification Friend or Foe system, had to work perfectly. Even with 99% IFF accuracy, it was estimated that 4 times as many bombers would be shot down compared to night fighters. In total, RAF Bomber Command lost 5,940 heavy bombers. In sharp contrast, just 260 of the speedy turretless Mosquito bombers were lost. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress, the ultimate expression of the self-defending bomber. The B-29 was a marvel of technology. Fully pressurized, it could fly over 3,000 miles and carry up to 20,000 pounds of bombs. Its most unique feature was the revolutionary General Electric remote-controlled turret system. Gunners no longer had to strap themselves into cold, cramped turrets. Equipped with 4 remote-controlled turrets and a gunner in the tail, the B-29 bristled with 12 .50 caliber machine guns. There were 4 assigned gunners. 3 manned their turrets from the pressurized position just aft of the wing. The upper and 2 side blister gunners controlled the upper aft turrets and lower rear turret. The bombardier or navigator controlled the front, top, and lower turrets. The tail gunner operated his alone. Designed to allow one gunner to control 2 turrets at once, it doubled his firepower at the flick of a switch.
So in 1944, probably one of the greatest bombers ever developed during World War II enters service. It's the Boeing B-29. It's streamlined, it's fast, it has great high-altitude performance, it has a Norden bomb sight, but it's also equipped with the world's first remote-controlled turret system. Developed by General Electric, the system is quite accurate. Each turret is controlled by an analog computer, and what the computer does is it takes care of speed, bullet drop, humidity, temperature, and lead. So the gunner in the B-29 does not have to worry about all those things. All the B-29 gunner has to do is steadily lead his target, and the computer will align the guns onto the target, and all the gunner has to do is pull the trigger.
What made it all work were the 5 central fire control computers. These computers analyzed the gun sight information, parallax, ballistics, and deflection. Electrical signals were then sent to the corresponding turrets, moving the guns into the right firing position. As long as the gunner tracked his target smoothly and adjusted for range, the system was effective. But it wasn't enough. Improvements were continually being made. The AN/APG-15B gun-laying radar. First installed in the B-29B, the new radar was advertised as a can't-miss system. Designed to log on to incoming enemy fighters, the radar proved unreliable and ineffective. Fortunately for B-29 crews, Japanese fighter defenses were feeble at best. After over 31,000 sorties over the Japanese home islands, fighters shot down only 74 B-29s. All told, 360 B-29s were lost to all causes.
As effective as the turret system was on the B-29, like the Germans, the Japanese were quick to adopt and discover one of the weaknesses in the B-29, which again was head-on attack. There was a certain area in front of the B-29 where the guns could not depress enough to cover that area. So the Japanese always tried to make head-on attacks as much as possible. But also, too, the Japanese air defense at the time in 1944 was quite anemic. They didn't have a lot of fighters, they didn't have a lot of well-trained crews, and at the height the B-29s flew, the performance of their fighters at high altitude was extremely poor. So what they adopted was a sort of kamikaze method of attacking the B-29, which was ramming. So they developed special ramming units. Now, it wasn't quite a certain death for the pilots. A lot of times what they tried to do is crash their aircraft into the B-29 and hopefully bail out. But it was an extremely risky job and required a great deal of pilot training in order to, get your fighter crashing into another B-29.
As in Europe, the long-range P-51 escort fighter would prove the best defense against enemy fighter attacks. Korea, 1951. B-29 gunners faced their greatest threat: the Soviet-built MiG-15 swept-wing fighter. Armed with two 23mm and one 37mm cannon, the MiG-15 was a true bomber killer. With its high speed and immense firepower, the MiG-15 could fire well outside the B-29's range. For most B-29 gunners, the swift MiG-15 was little more than a distant blur. Unable to cope with the fast-attacking MiGs, the B-29s were forced to abandon all daylight raids. The Korean War and the buildup of nuclear weapons ushered in a new era, the Cold War. Soviet Russia was now the enemy. Armed with atomic bombs, the US and the Soviet Union now stood toe-to-toe in a world defined by mad, mutually assured destruction. Early nuclear weapons were big and bulky devices. Getting them to a target required an aircraft with intercontinental range. Enter the Convair B-36. Designed to bomb Germany from the US, the B-36 continued the false belief in the self-defending bomber. The B-36 was a behemoth, a wingspan of 230 feet with 6 3,000 horsepower radial engines. Armed with 16 20mm cannon and 8 remote-controlled turrets, the B-36 was the most heavily armed strategic bomber ever produced. The turrets, however, proved problematic. Recoil vibration affected the electrical wiring. Vacuum tubes were jarred loose, causing some electronics to malfunction. Even with its powered turrets, the B-36's ability to defend itself was still an issue. Several parasite fighter concepts were tried, including a trapeze-mounted fighter in the bomb bay and wingtip-mounted RF-84Fs. The concept met with limited success and was soon abandoned. At the same time that the Air Force was developing the monster-sized B-36, they were also looking into a much smaller and cheaper bomber, and one with advanced turrets of its own. At the end of World War II, Douglas created prototypes for an innovative experimental bomber, the XB-42, also known as the Mixmaster. This was a pusher aircraft with 2 engines in the fuselage, driving a pair of contra-rotating propellers in the tail. Placing the props in the tail not only produced a more aerodynamic design, it also left room in the wings for rear-firing retractable machine gun turrets. Although these aircraft could fly at record-setting speeds, and a jet-powered variant was in the works, the project was shelved. The swept-wing Boeing B-47, along with the B-52, spelled the end of the powered turret, but not the Stinger's tail. Both aircraft were equipped with early remote-controlled tail turrets. Early versions of the B-47 carried 2 50 caliber machine guns, later upgunned to the 2 20mm cannon. The B-52 Stratofortress. Operational since 1955, the B-52 is the longest-serving combat aircraft in the U.S. Air Force service. It's also credited with the last air-to-air victories using a powered turret. The early B-52s, the A model through F, were equipped with a manned tail turret, armed with 4 50 caliber machine gun and the A3A fire control system. The G model moved the gunner to the forward crew compartment, but retained the 4 50 caliber machine guns. Armament in the B-52H changed to a single 20mm Vulcan cannon. December 18, 1972. Operation Linebacker. 6 days later, tail gunner airman First Class Albert Moore claimed another MiG-21. These two claims, however, were never confirmed by the North Vietnamese Air Force. They were the last fighters to be shot down by a powered gun turret. Today, the power turret has all but disappeared. There are, however, a few bombers that still have the Stinger's tail. The Tupolev Tu-95 Bear. Like the B-52, the Tu-95 is a Cold War classic. A gunner still mans the rear turret, but his job is all but obsolete. Isolated from the rest of the crew, it can be a lonely proposition. Air Commodore Phil Wilkinson recalls the complications of extracting the tail gunner for a photograph at the Fairford Air Show.
The tail gunner. Where was he? Well, answer, there's no throughway through the aeroplane to get to it. And although he was able to climb in whilst at base, he climbed in by going up onto the revetment, opening the hatch and getting in from ground level, as it were. We're now on the ground at Fairford, and he's about 22 feet above the ground. And he can open his hatch, but he can't get out. So eventually, and it took a long time, we found somebody with a ladder, and out he came, and we then had the complete team photo.
Today, the strategic bomber relies on speed, stealth, and a vast array of electronic countermeasures for protection. The era of the manned powered turret was a short, unsuccessful experiment. While marvels of technology, they could never overcome the grim realities of air-to-air combat. In the end, it was the fighter that always got through.
When I arrived in Moscow in the first week of January 1993, as we came out of the cloud, I was entering that foreign hostile territory that I'd been trained to operate against for the past 35 years. Suddenly there I was in the middle of it all, in the snow. Anyway, I got there and it was the old system. It was the old Russian bear. I was not going to be given too much of a welcome. I had diplomatic immunity, or I would have when I'd been signed in. But nevertheless, I was not expecting a great deal of eager cooperation. And indeed, my task was to see as much of them as I could without annoying them sufficiently to get them really annoyed. The spring of 1994, Paul Bowen, who was then the driving force and the chief executive, as it were, of the RAF Benevolent Fund's International Air Tattoo, alternating in those years, occasionally from Greenham Common, but more usually from Fairford, down in Gloucestershire. And I got a call saying, we'd really love to have a Russian bear, or preferably two Russian bears, come to Fairford. Can you fix it? I said, well, no, but I will go and ask. I suspect the answer is not going to be anything other than niet. They just don't seem to be up for this sort of thing. I phoned, I made an appointment, and I went and I spoke to my man in the UVS, and he said yes. I said, can I just have that absolutely certainly? There will be no objection to a pair of Russian aircraft going to an air display in England in the summer of this year. No, he said, I think that will be okay. So I checked back with Paul Bowen, and he said, that's amazing, that is astonishing. Tell me how the thing develops. So I went back to UVS and said again, they're very happy in the UK, they're very delighted this is going to happen. Now, when are we going to know which aircraft and so forth? And they said, well, there's something that we should make clear. We will obviously have to support these aircraft because they're going to be away from base in a foreign setting. And so we've got a support team, and here's the list. And he handed me a list which ran to, I think, 3 pages. There were 76 names on it. They contained the 2 crews, 13 in each aircraft, and then, I think that's 26, another 50 nearly all of whom were colonels or above of the Russian Air Force and the Russian Naval Air Service. There were a couple of warrant officers and there were some majors, but effectively it was a bunch of boys out for a good trip. They would all be travelling in a Revolution 76, Candid, and all three aircraft would be expected to have full refuelling facilities and full tanks before they left the UK, and they would obviously wish for appropriate accommodation, hotel accommodation, and given the current situation, they'd really rather like some spending money for these individuals. So I went back and phoned Paul and said, are you ready for this? I don't know what the fuel capacity is of a Bear, but you're going to have to fill two of them up, and if you want one of them to fly, you'll obviously have to fill it each time it does its display, and we'll have a Candid, and then we've got 76 people who want hotel accommodation, entertainment, and money to spend. And he said, yeah, it'll be okay. So I went back again and said to the Russians, that's fine, it's all agreed, accepted, I've got the list, and I will be sending it to the authorities in the UK so they know who they will have to take in clearance terms, Russian embassy, so forth. Then I had a call from Paul Byrne and said, hey, this is fantastic, and I've got an idea. I want Central TV to send a crew out, and probably just a director and a cameraman, but I think we ought to be able to film this from the whole start point in Russia. So the arrival in Fairford, displaying in Fairford and going away. I said, well, I can ask. He said, well, could you make sure that the request includes the cameraman flying in the Bear? I said, no, Paul. Well, yes, all right, I'll ask. And I went back to my friend in UAS and I said, right, this is the sketch. They would like a camera team, or a television team with a cameraman, to come over and film the expedition, and indeed to film from inside one of the operational aircraft. That's okay, said the Russian, and I was stupefied by this. But I had the presence of mind to say at that stage, well, in that case, since these Russian aircraft will be going as a gaggle of three into British airspace and so forth, and now you've got a British cameraman and so on crawling around the bottom of one of the aircraft, I think you ought to have me on board as a sort of on-board interpreter. You know, air traffic control procedures, air traffic language. There's got to be some guarantee that it'll all be understood and responded to properly. Yeah, okay. So all of a sudden, from what I thought was a complete no chance, we now have three aeroplanes, two operational Bears, a Candid full of generals and admirals, a TV crew on board one of them, and me alongside as well. And that's exactly what happened. The Russian main airfield outside Moscow, military airfield, Chkalovsky, I rendezvoused with the TV team. We then went out there and we rendezvoused with the Candid load. We clambered on board the Candid and flew up to the naval main station in Kaliningrad, in the enclave on the Baltic shore there. We landed, parked the aircraft. The Bears were already there. The naval aviation one was on its home base. The Russian Air Force one had flown up from somewhere in the south. And so the base commander came to meet us and said, hurry along, put your bags in the accommodation because we're going to have a little party. And so we put our bags in the accommodation. We came back out, got into a series of Russian equivalents of jeeps, Land Rovers and so on, and shot away to the Baltic shore. A couple of wrecked bits of old shipping were on the sand, and we went and played amongst those. I also noticed that there were long, long tables set out on the cliff top with much interesting salady things getting quite sort of warm in the bright sunshine. Lots of glasses and lots of bottles, and some of the bottles were beer. And I said to the Russians, I think if we're going to go and have a swim, we might take some of these bottles down with us and we can leave them in the sea and get them cool because they're not doing much. And drinking warm beer, that may be your idea of what the Brits do, but it's not mine. So, in fact, we carried a couple of cases of beer down, we had a good swim, and we put the beer in to get it cool, and we came back up. The base commander then appeared in his underpants and with his tame chef behind him, and they came to the open-air stoves and started, the cook started to cook, and the base commander started to make us welcome, which, of course, involved the large glasses that we had, which were sort of jam jar size and jam jar capacity, and into which the first of the vodka of the day was now being poured. And that's the way it continued. It continued for a long afternoon and into the early evening. And the food came and the vodka continued. The food came again and more vodka. And slowly but surely, in particular, my unfortunates from Central TV became, how shall we say, slightly confused about everything. At the end of it all, which had been a thoroughly wonderful afternoon's picnic, by now quite towards mid-evening, we got back into the vehicles and disappeared back towards the main base. Pausing only at the halfway distance, someone obviously felt the need. Out jumped the Deputy Commander of the Air Force and the Chief of Staff of Naval Aviation to insist that it was time we had a drink for the road. So we paused and had a couple of drinks for the road. And then we got back, and I think my TV chums now thought this was time for bed, Zebedee. But no, it's time for the banya, the sauna. So we carried forward, stripped off, went into the cabin, were superheated, hit with steam from all directions, with large lumps of birch by a lady, and then we plunged into the cold pool, and then we rushed outside, and then came back in and went all through it again, and eventually subsided into a series of small lounging chairs and had some more vodka, really. And that was where it ended, and it was where it ended for everybody, especially the two TV folks. The next morning was just quite a gentle start, I think is the best way. But we got into our aeroplanes. I clambered up into the Navy Bear, the Tupolev 142, and I looked around for where the television chaps were, and they said, no, they're going to travel in the Candid, in the glazed nose of the Candid, and then they'll be able to film the whole thing, and we know we're going to be intercepted by everybody, any dog, as we go through the Baltic and out into the North Sea. Everyone will want to have a look at the gaggle of bears. So they'll travel in the Candid, at which stage I got into my seat, halfway down the back on the left side of the aeroplane. It was interesting. They started all the engines and then shut down the two inboards and taxied on the outboard engines. We taxied quite fast and got ahead of the Air Force version and got airborne and turned left heading for UK. And I said, you know, aren't we waiting for the system to gather us all together? And they said, no, we're off now, we're going. That's fine. And looking down, I could see the Air Force version just getting onto the runway. And the Candid probably not even started its engines at that stage. And they never did catch up. So there never was a Central TV documentary film made of the flight of the Bear, which was a shame. On the other hand, it meant that I didn't have to give my attention to translating for their directorial announcements and so on from their filming position, because they weren't there. I was impressed to see how well they did work as a crew, and I noticed how much of a sort of challenge and response, an exchange of words and music went on as they got this gigantic set of engines going at the start. Bit of a laborious process. It wasn't just master switch on, press the button and go. It took a little time. An extraordinarily versatile aeroplane. Its variety of weapon systems, anti-shipping, anti-submarine, anti-radar, just basic long-range bombing missions, long-range surveillance missions, and long-range is a feature. I mean, they used to fly to Cuba via Iceland with no stops on the way. I mean, they were quite capable of gigantic journeys. The Poles came up and had a look, the Germans came and had a look, the Danes, the Norwegians, and then we got through the Baltic and out the other side. But the next thing we saw was a gaggle of tornadoes, F-3s, came in. And there's an awful lot of photographs of tornadoes intercepting bears and lightnings intercepting bears and so on. And there's always, you know, someone's Air Force wall has always got, there's me with the bear, you know, and in my tornado or whatever. Well, I took pictures from the inside of the bear, and I was able to present at least two of the pilots with a picture of them seen from the other side. So the tornado looking along the wing and down past those gigantic contra-rotating propellers, there were tornadoes stuck in on the wing. There was a great atmosphere of a great crew working together atmosphere. They were all pretty excited because although they'd obviously all probably flown past the British coast on a number of occasions, or around the Baltic and over the top, they were nonetheless all going to be going actually into the enemy airspace, as it were, not to be threatened, but to be welcomed and put on the ground. So there was a lot of excitement. The navigators in particular and the systems operators had very little to do, so they were all clattering around trying to get near all the considerable number of windows and glazed areas so they could see what was going on. There were people taking lots of film shots from inside for their personal diaries. Great stuff. We landed, having been escorted in all the way. The Air Force One caught up very soon after, and the Candid, probably 20 minutes later. One of the Navy front-end chaps, as we landed, said, we must have a team photo. They have the same approach as aviators worldwide. Let's have a team photo. So we all clambered out of the airplane and stood in front of it under the nose, and a spare body, not of the crew, got the camera ready. And someone said, wait a minute, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Oh, of course, the tail gunner. Where was he? Well, answer, he was still in his turret. There's no throughway through the aeroplane to get to him. And although he was able to climb in whilst at base, he climbed in by going up onto the revetment, opening the hatch and getting in from ground level, as it were. We're now on the ground at Fairford, and he's about 22 feet above the ground. And he can open his hatch, but he can't get out. So eventually, and it took a long time, we found somebody with a ladder, and out he came, and we then had the complete team photo. Then we had a week of looking after the Russians on the loose in England with entertainment money in their pockets. There was some highlights, some of which are probably best left discreetly to one side, but both crews were surprised to find them being the centre of attention. The King of Jordan, King Hussein at the time, came to visit, a great enthusiast for aviation, always has been, and he was taken up inside our bear and sat at the controls and had a good time. He and Queen Noor were introduced to the crew. Another visitor was coming the following day, and it was scheduled to be also a visit to the naval aircraft because the Air Force One was going to be the one that did the daily display. So we were going to be on show on the ground. Interestingly parked between a B-52 and a B-1, and there was a lot of interplay between the crews of those two, who I don't think had ever received Russian admirals on board their aircraft before, nor, I think, had the Russians received a B-1 colonel before on board. But that's another piece of the story. But one lovely morning, the Russian Navy crew had been slightly over-refreshed and were a bit late on parade. They came galloping up, but too late for the visitor, who was, in fact, His Royal Highness Prince Michael of Kent, who many years back I knew was working in the Defence Intelligence Staff when I was, and he was learning Russian at the time. And, of course, if you've seen Prince Michael of Kent, you'll know that he looks just like the last Tsar, Nicholas II. He is a dead ringer for the Tsar. And so when this Navy crew came galloping up, they formed up at the bottom of the steps of the aircraft, knowing there was a VIP on board. And when he came down and walked towards them and addressed them in Russian, you could see their little brains were in turmoil. What on earth's going on? What is this? I'm not sure that there is a Russian candid camera, or you've been framed, but they were convinced there was some grotesque joke going on. It's wonderful. Absolutely marvellous. The long and the short of it was that we wrapped up at the end of a week, because we'd arrived 2 days before the weekend of shows, and we left after the shows were all over. And my last memory, and probably the last memory that the receiving British will retain, is that our accommodation was in the Bear Hotel. Nearly all of us were in the Bear Hotel in Hungerford. And the last morning, breakfast was being served at the usual pace and with the usual contents. Russians rather enjoyed the full English. They thought that was a good idea. But their own stockkeeping and logistics management had gone to pot, and they'd got no vodka. So they needed some vodka to help the breakfast time. That's the sort of thing you do. And so the Bear Hotel of Hungerford, the hotel manager, I still don't know that he was really feeling that he could do it, but he was asked if he could serve some ice-cold vodka with breakfast, if you don't mind. He eventually did, and that was fine. And we then proceeded. I have to say, I'll be quite fair here, the upfront operating members of the crew were not drinking vodka at breakfast time. Some of those further down the back were, however, and enjoying it. But we clambered back into the air and went off and did the return journey. It was about a 3-hour sort, just short of 3 hours. And we were again escorted, some lovely pictures of tornadoes out on the wing and others coming in. One of the non-operating accompanying fellows blagged his way onto our aeroplane on the way back. He wanted to get back faster than the gaggle who were coming home in the Candid. So he hitched a ride with us, and all the rest were in standard sort of grow bag green, rather like our flying suits. Not a great deal of difference there. He was in a lightweight blue one, and I said, that's very smart. And he was sitting on the floor beside me. And he was one of those who had breakfast with vodka, and he'd found a bottle in his bag, and he was now having some more. So until he became totally incoherent, I asked him a number of questions, and he was tear-stained because I said, why have you got this lightweight blue suit? He said, that's what we always wore when we went to Cuba. Oh, Cuba. The sun, he said, the sand, the sea, sex. Oh. I mean, he clearly had enjoyed his chance in the other totalitarian regime of the world, ignoring North Korea. And Cuba was obviously a haven. And of course, if you served in the far north of Russia for most of your serving life, first thing you have to recall is that that was not all the bad that it could be, because for those serving in the far north, there was an immediate pay supplement, which tended to take the edge off some of the hardship up there. But if your normal sort of operating area was the Barents Sea and the Iceland-Faroes Gap, and then it was your turn to go to Cuba, I sympathise with him. You know, he was a non-operating part of the crew, and he was not going to operate anything once he got home. I flew the last half of the journey up front, and I was agreeably surprised. The size of that airframe, of course, there's a gigantic amount of inertia. And like any old heavy, you turn the thing with a great yoke, and you get it like that, and then you wait for the wing to catch up and do it. And when the wing starts to move to that sort of angle, just wind it off the other way, and then you're nice and stable in a turn. Down the slope into Kaliningrad, easily managed, quite extraordinary. Throttle handling and all the rest, even with all those peculiar engines out on the wing, which I'd never flown with before. I'd flown piston engine only, or jet only, but turboprop, no, and responses and so on I wasn't sure of. But it did what it was asked to, and putting it on the ground on the numbers, I have to say, at the risk of being laughed to scorn, was straightforward. There must be rather more to it than simply that, because the Navy pilot next to me was very quick to take control of it, so I suspect the braking and other ground handling aspects of the aeroplane are a bit more of a challenge, because it is a big one and a heavy one. But it was a great trip. It showed the aircraft off well. It certainly achieved something I thought was never going to be achieved, and in fact, since then, there have been bears going into Barksdale in Arkansas, in the US, and other places. It was a bit of a first. It was certainly a first to have the Navy and the Air Force One together side by side in the UK, and as such, I'm thrilled to bits. It was at a sort of high spot of Russian cooperation. So, an extraordinary experience, one that I could go on describing for a long time. I think the impact, the whole essence of the flight was that it was so unusual and so unexpected. I was thunderstruck. My ghast was totally flabbered, because I couldn't believe that when I made this, to me, outlandish request to have airplanes of that kind come and put themselves on the ground and be the object of full attention from the British and others. I couldn't believe it would happen, but not one, but two, and then a great gang of others.